Welcome back to the channel. It's the Fantasy Football Strategist here. In today's video, we are delving through the top 36 wide receivers for the 2024 fantasy football season. In our F tier, we have Hollywood Brown, Keenan Allen, Christian Kirk, Chris Godwin, Tank Dell, and Jaden Reed. Later this week, by the way, we are going to have our top 36 running back rankings and tight end rankings. Please remember to like and subscribe. So first we have Hollywood Brown at wide receiver 36. He is dealing with an injury, although as of now it's reported that he's probably not going to miss week 1. Obviously, if he misses some time, he might go down a little bit in these rankings, but for now, we're just going to go under the assumption that he's not going to miss any time. So he goes from Arizona to the Kansas City Chiefs. One fun fact, even though he only had 574 receiving yards, he finished 11th in the NFL with 789 unrealized air yards. He was used really far downfield. He didn't have the benefit of playing with Kyler Murray for a good majority of the season. Now he goes to the Kansas City Chiefs, so we expect that his target accuracy is going to be quite good this season. The only issue is they have Travis Kelce to play tight end. They have Rashee Rice as a big slot. They have Xavier Worthy to be a stretch Z for them. So it's really going to force Marquise Brown to the X position, and he is not the best receiver against press coverage. There's definitely worse. And while the one benefit potentially is that he should be on the field more, which will generally make it so that he has more opportunity to earn targets, it's just a little bit of a crowded wide receiver room, and thus his ceiling is a little bit limited. The next player in this F tier is new Chicago Bears wide receiver Keenan Allen. So he's 32.3 years old, and that's generally well above the age of a wide receiver that's going to be contributing for you for your fantasy football teams. He is a special talent, however. He finished 3rd in the NFL with 21.5 fantasy points per game this past season. The only issue is that was with the Chargers. Now he's with the Bears, and now, while I do think that his quarterback play is going to be magnificent, he, just like Hollywood Brown before him, is dealing with ridiculous target competition. Where do we start? DeAndre Swift out of the backfield is going to be receiving a good amount of targets. Then they have Cole Kmet and Gerald Everett at the tight end position. Then they have 3 wide receiver ones, including Keenan Allen, in DJ Moore and Rome Odunze, as well as Keenan Allen. So overall, a very crowded room. It's unrealistic to expect them to have 5,000 passing yards to really be able to support all of these guys. So I do think that really all of their ceilings are a little bit limited this season. I do think he's going to be safe on a weekly basis. I do think he's going to receive one of the larger target shares in this offense. I just think that it's going to be underneath, so his upside is potentially limited, also due to the fact that he's definitely not receiving 170 targets anymore. He may have big boom weeks here and there when he's able to score, a touchdown or two. I just don't see him being the elite wide receiver for us in fantasy this season, and he's really a victim of circumstance. He's quite talented. It's just like some of these other receivers in this tier, he's in a situation where there's so many playmakers around him that it's going to be hard for him to get consistent volume to be the elite asset at wide receiver. My wide receiver 34 is Christian Kirk of the Jacksonville Jaguars, so he's 27.7 years old. One fun fact, his 48.6% win rate versus man was good for 7th in the entire NFL. He is going to be a very reliable option for Trevor Lawrence on 3rd downs. The only issue? There was a lot of target competition added. They still have Evan Ingram at tight end. They brought in Brian Thomas Jr. to stretch the field as a vertical Z. They have Gabe Davis to be a vertical X. Christian Kirk still will man the slot. It's just, I don't think the volume is going to be quite as good as it has been in past seasons. I do expect him to probably lead the Jaguars in total receiving yards this season. Say what you want about Gabe Davis, but I believe he does have one of, if not the highest touchdown rate in terms of touchdowns per catches in NFL history. He is a very good touchdown scorer. Then Brian Thomas is going to be a very good asset for them in the red zone, being a little bit over 6'3". Now, while that is going to clear things up for him underneath, they are going to be receiving a good amount of targets, especially with Evan Ingram in the fold here. I do expect them also to want to be a little bit more balanced with running with Travis Etienne. It really wasn't effective this past season, but their line should be a little bit better this season, thus reducing his overall ceiling. But I do expect him to be a very solid floor player, and just like these other players in this tier, it's just a crowded receiving room. My wide receiver 33 is Chris Godwin of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So he's 6'1", 209 pounds, and he is 28.4 years old. That's over the age apex of 26. I do expect him to have a little bit of a down year compared to what he did this past season, which wasn't a great year for him particularly. Maybe not so much in terms of because of a lack of talent or a specific decline in regards to his play. It's just with Dave Canales moving to the Carolina Panthers to take their head coaching position, I don't expect this offense to be nearly as efficient this season. He still has to contend with Mike Evans. Cade Otton was starting to break out. They drafted Jalen McMillan. They still have Trey Palmer. And while I do expect Chris Godwin to be the number 2 in this offense, I just don't see the offense being nearly as efficient. One fun fact about him is his 51.2% win rate versus man coverage was good for second in the NFL. So he's still looking like he's going to be a very consistent player on third downs to move the chains, thus giving him a relatively safe floor. I just think his ceiling is limited. At wide receiver 32, I have Tank Dell of the Houston Texans. He's coming off a broken leg. Fun fact, about a week ago I did a poll where I asked which of the 3 Texans wide receivers was going to be the worst value at their ADP. I think that y'all chose correctly, and I think that Tank Dell is not going to be the worst value at his ADP. I have him at wide receiver 32 personally, and he's going off the board as the wide receiver 29, which I think is just a little bit too high, but it's only a couple spots of difference, so it's and obviously that's just my personal projection. So I do agree with y'all that he is, of the 3 at least, going to be one of the better values compared to where he's going in drafts. One fun fact about him, his 2.36 yards per route run were good for 14th in the entire NFL this past season. He was one of the better wide receivers on a per route basis. He did have that broken leg. The only issue? Well, they traded for Stefan Diggs. Diggs is going to demand, and I literally mean I think demand, targets in this offense, whether or not he deserves them, which I think he's still a good player, but I think he's going to demand a large target share, throw a tantrum on the sidelines personally. And I just think that this is going to limit Tank Dell's ceiling in terms of his fantasy finish, and it's going to make him a very inconsistent player. I think all of these guys are going to be very inconsistent in Houston. I think C.J. Stroud is going to be the one common denominator that you want in fantasy. But yeah, so he has to deal with Dalton Schultz, Nico Collins, and Stefan Diggs. And then they also brought in Joe Mixon, so I think they're going to run the ball a little bit more this season than they did this past season. Overall, I'm generally out on Texans wide receivers, but if you can get Tank Dell at wide receiver 32, a little bit after his normal ADP, I would be totally down for it. At wide receiver 31 and the final receiver in this tier, I have Packers wide receiver Jaden Reed. So he's 24.3 years old, going into his second season with the Packers. One fun fact about him is 45.2% win rate versus man was good for 12th in the entire NFL. And he's going to be a very reliable option on third downs for Jordan Love. He is Jordan Love's, or at least this past season was, Jordan Love's preferred option in the red zone. He had 10 touchdowns, including his rushing touchdowns. So it is possible that he doesn't have quite the finish he did this past season due to probable touchdown regression, but I do expect his role to increase, and I think he can play as a Z and a Y wide receiver for them. He generally played Y in the slot for them. He gets end arounds. He was compared to a very small Devo Samuel. I agree in the sense of the role that they had, but not really the actual player themselves. But he's very, very talented. He's adept at separation and winning his routes. Very good route runner. I just think that there's a lot of mouths to feed in Green Bay. And while I do think that he has a lot of potential ceiling if he can establish himself as the wide receiver one, Dontavian Wicks has looked really good. There's been reports that Romeo Doubs is the preferred guy. Christian Watson had been viewed as the number one for years now. They have 2 solid tight ends. They just signed Josh Jacobs, so maybe they start running the ball a little bit more than they did this past season. Overall, it's a little bit crowded, and we're unsure as to who per se is going to be the top target earner and top fantasy scorer in this situation, but there is a lot of upside here, admittedly. The next tier consists of Terry McLaurin, George Pickens, Deontay Johnson, T. Higgins, Zay Flowers, and Devonte Smith. One fun fact about him is 848 unrealized receiving yards were good for 9th in the entire NFL, and that essentially epitomizes his entire career in Washington. I feel horrible for this guy. He's 28.9 years old, so a little bit further along in his career, but he's still a very, very good receiver. I do think that this is the year that he does have some upside. He should be the number one wide receiver. He's very good deep, and Jaden Daniels, you could argue him or Caleb Williams has the best deep ball in this class, but either way, Jaden Daniels has a very, very good deep ball. I think he's going to actually be able to get Terry McLaurin the ball, unlike Sam Howell and every other quarterback that he's ever played with. It's just, I don't think this offense is going to be that great. And I think that Jaden Daniels and Brian Robinson Jr. are going to steal a lot of touchdowns on the ground. He is, though, the dominant number one target on this team. I just think they're not going to score that many points per game, and like I said a second ago, I think a lot of their touchdowns are going to come via the ground. At wide receiver 29, I have George Pickens of the Pittsburgh Steelers. He's still only 23.4 years old, and by the way, his 18.1 yards per reception was good for first in the NFL. One reason I mention this is with them getting Russell Wilson and him presumably being their starter, at least to begin the season, we might end up seeing more of those Russell Wilson moonballs that he's always known to have throughout his career. They became famous with DK Metcalf. I do think that George Pickens can play a similar role to DK Metcalf as a deep threat at the X position. Unfortunately, I don't think this is going to be the best offense. Arthur Smith is Arthur Smith, and now while he was successful with the Tennessee Titans, I think that it was really the run game that was the reason for their success. And now, while you might point out A.J. Brown is a better receiver than George Pickens. George Pickens is a good receiver. I believe that he's an above-average X receiver in the NFL. I just don't see the real upside because I don't think this is going to be the best offense, and I think that they're going to run the ball a lot this season. Jaylen Warren is one of the better running backs in the league. Seriously, look at his advanced metrics. I've mentioned them in past videos. And then Najee Harris fits the power run game that Arthur Smith likes to run. He's probably going to be used a little bit more like Derrick Henry used to be in Tennessee. But overall, I think they're just going to run the ball a lot. I don't think they're going to score a ton of points. And even though he's the number one wide receiver in this offense, I just don't think there's going to be a lot of touchdowns to be scored here. And with Russell Wilson declining and his backup being Justin Fields, I just don't see the massive upside that we would like. And I think he will finish right around the wide receiver 30. I have him as the wide receiver 29, just like this past season. Next, we have Deontay Johnson, my wide receiver 28. He left the Steelers to join the Panthers. I do like that he has Dave Canales as his head coach, so the play calling should be pretty good. He does have a little bit of a crowded situation, though, with Adam Thielen in the slot and Xavier Legette likely being the vertical X in this offense. I project Deontay Johnson to play mostly Z for them. He should be the number one target. It's just how effective is this offense going to be? Bryce Young is a very short quarterback, and he has his limitations working the middle of the field. So I'm just wary of this offense, and I think Deontay Johnson's going to be a very safe floor player. I just don't think this offense is going to score quite as many points as we've seen Dave Canales' offenses score in the past couple of years. Thus, giving him a little bit of a lower ceiling than we would like with some of these players going before him. My wide receiver 27 is T. Higgins of the Cincinnati Bengals. He's only 25.5 years old. One thing I'll say is I've been trying to bring up one positive stat per player here. T. Higgins has gotten worse every single year. There really isn't anything to bring up here. I think that he's a better wide receiver on film, per se, than any individual metric will tell you. He can be a dominant winner of the ball downfield. He just doesn't get much separation. He's not a particularly good route runner. He's more of a contested catch guy. He does have a lot of height. He's also dealt with injuries, and now we can't predict injuries. I think that he's just a very inconsistent player who's going to have some spike weeks when he gets, 100 yards and a touchdown, but then he's also going to have your 3 for 41 games, thus giving him a very low floor but a pretty good ceiling from week to week. Next, we have Zay Flowers at wide receiver 26. Fun fact, his 49.2% win rate versus man coverage was good for 6th in the NFL as a rookie. He's adept at getting open versus man coverage, so he's going to be a crucial part of the offense for third down conversions. He is the undisputed number 2 option in the passing game after Mark Andrews. I think that his wide receiver 31 finish, I think he's going to build on that just a little bit. I just think as the second option in a Derrick Henry and Lamar Jackson-led offense, the passing game as a second option is going to be a little bit inconsistent. I think he's going to have his spike weeks when he gets, just like with T. Higgins, 100 yards and a touchdown. I just think that his weekly floor is going to be a little bit lower than we would prefer with some of these guys going ahead of him. The final player in this tier and at wide receiver 25 is Devonte Smith of the Philadelphia Eagles. He finished as the wide receiver 19 this past season. I do think with Saquon Barkley in town, they're going to run a little bit more than they did this past season, thus reducing the total amount of pass attempts this season, which I think will lower everybody's ceiling in this offense, at least in the passing game. One fun fact is 2.26 fantasy points per target versus man coverage was good for 7th in the NFL. He is one of the more adept wide receivers at winning on third downs, along with some of these other wide receivers that we've just spoken about. He's very reliable. The only issue, he's the number 2 behind A.J. Brown. It just limits his potential ceiling. And while he's generally a pretty safe floor player, he just doesn't have a crazy high ceiling from week to week. He's just generally a pretty good bet to get you at least 10 points every week. And I just think with the potential reduced passing volume this year with Saquon Barkley being in town, that it's just going to lower Devonte Smith's ceiling. The next tier of wide receivers are DJ Moore, Nico Collins, Stefan Diggs, Cooper Kupp, and Amari Cooper. So at wide receiver 24, I have DJ Moore. He just finished as the wide receiver 6, so you might be asking yourself, what's the reason for being so far down the rankings? Well, while he does project to have an immense QB upgrade going from Justin Fields to Caleb Williams, that also comes with Keenan Allen and Rome Odunze being introduced to the offense. So that means they have 3 wide receiver 1s on this team. They have 2 pass-catching tight ends, a pass-catching running back. And with a rookie quarterback, you really can't expect any one of these guys to have the ceiling season that any one of them could potentially have if they were the clear number 1 option on their team. But his 2.35 fantasy points per target versus man coverage were good for 4th in the NFL this past season. And he is one of the better wide receivers in the NFL. I just think that his ceiling is really capped. I think he's going to have big boom weeks, but then a very low floor some weeks, because even if he's the number 1 option, they don't draft Rome Odunze at 9 to not give him any targets. They don't trade for Keenan Allen to not give him any targets. And there are other options in this passing attack that are going to be fed targets. So while I do project him to lead the receiving room, both in fantasy points and targets, his ceiling is massively capped. At wide receiver 23, I have Nico Collins of the Houston Texans. As I said earlier, I made a poll asking who would be the most overrated wide receiver at their current ADP from the Texans. Well, about 18%, the second most, said Nico Collins. He's going off the board as the wide receiver 15. He is coming off a wide receiver 12 fantasy finish. I just think with the added target competition of Stefan Diggs, along with his need to be the number 1 option and get a ton of targets, or he'll throw a tantrum, that it's really going to hurt the ceiling and floor of every Texans wide receiver. So he's only 25.4 years old, and he is on his way up. He is a very good player. I just think that C.J. Stroud is the guy you want to own in this offense, or even Joe Mixon at running back. And unless C.J. Stroud has a 5,000-yard passing season and each one of these guys can get 1,200 yards, there's no way that Stefan Diggs is going to live up to his wide receiver 16 ADP, and Nico Collins is going to live up to his wide receiver 15 ADP. And they'll all have to score a good amount of touchdowns. Basically, these ADPs suggest that you think C.J. Stroud is going to have a Patrick Mahomes type of season, in an MVP level season, by the way, from, say, 2018 or 2022. I don't foresee that happening, even though C.J. Stroud is a very good quarterback, and thus I see him finishing as a low-end wide receiver 2, but I do think he's going to have huge weeks and then some very low weeks. I will say, though, his 2.56 fantasy points per target versus man coverage were good for first in the entire NFL. So he is going to be a reliable target for C.J. Stroud. It's just, what is the overall volume going to look like, and is there going to be any consistency? I personally don't think so, which is why he's a little bit further down these rankings than his ADP suggests. Next, we have Stefan Diggs. He is coming off a finish as the wide receiver 9. I have him at wide receiver 22, right next to Nico Collins. I think that he and Nico Collins are going to generally be the number one target in terms of overall target volume and fantasy finishes on a week-to-week basis. I just think there's not going to be any consistency. I do think he is going to lead the team in targets, though, because he is going to whine and demand these targets. Otherwise, he's just going to be cancerous to the team. Therefore, I think if you own him in fantasy football, I think he's going to bully his way into being able to get targets, thus helping you out in that regard at least. One fun fact is he had 869 unrealized receiving yards this past season, which is good for 8th in the NFL. So he could have had a much better season than he did have. We saw right around week 9, he went from being an elite stud wide receiver 1 to basically falling off the map and only having, I believe it was one game of 15 or more points the whole entire second half of the season. I'm personally completely out at his wide receiver 16 ADP. I think if you were able to get him as a low-end wide receiver 2, around the wide receiver 22 or so, that it could be worth it. I think he's going to give you very high highs. I just think his week-to-week consistency in this offense is not going to be what we've come to know in his days in Buffalo. At wide receiver 21, I have Cooper Kupp of the Los Angeles Rams. He is 31.1 years old. He actually did, though, perform better this past season than he did the year before, which doesn't make a lot of sense if you think about, well, he was the number one wide receiver in terms of fantasy points per game in 2022. Then he went way down in 2023. How does that make any sense? Well, his total win rate and win rate versus man specifically went way up from 2022 to 2023, suggesting that he was able to get open and win his routes at a much higher rate in 2023 than he did the prior season. In fact, his 44.8% win rate versus man coverage was good for 16th in the NFL, so he's still a very solid receiver. The only issue, Puka Nakua's in town. So he is going to be presumptively their wide receiver 1 because they did somewhat trade off games being the most targeted wide receiver, but it is fair to expect just a little bit of decline with Cooper Kupp being over 31 years old and Puka Nacua only being 23 years old. This passing attack, fortunately though, will basically funnel through him and Nacua exclusively, with some running back targets and maybe a couple tight end targets. So he should be a very high volume player, and I think he's going to be a very, very safe floor player who, through a good amount of projected volume, should be a very solid wide receiver 2. The final player in this tier, and my wide receiver 20, is Amari Cooper. Funnily enough, he's coming off a wide receiver 20 finish. That was completely unintentional. I think he's going to finish right around the same as he did this past season. He's 30 years old, so it's fair very soon, if not this year, to expect some decline in his game. I will say, though, his 841 unrealized air yards were good for 10th in the entire NFL, so he could have had a much better season, although he did take off with Joe Flacco at quarterback. He did not have the same stats per game with Deshaun Watson at the helm. So I do worry a little bit about Amari Cooper. I think he's a very, very talented player. I just think that decline is due to set in either now or very, very soon. And I think he just doesn't offer the same weekly ceiling in what figures to be a reasonably run-heavy Browns attack. In the C tier, we have DK Metcalf, Deebo Samuel, Chris Olave, and Brandon Aiyuk. So at wide receiver 19, I have DK Metcalf. He's coming off a wide receiver 21 finish. I suspect he's going to finish just a little bit further ahead than he did this past season, but I will say he does have the ability to move much further in these rankings. I just think with the crowded wide receiver room with Tyler Lockett and JSN, along with a solid pass-catching tight end in Noah Fant, and two good running backs in Kenneth Walker and Zach Charbonnet, that it's going to be a very well-rounded offense, and it's not going to funnel through DK Metcalf quite as much as it has in the past. But I will say his 772 unrealized air yards this past season were good for 12th in the NFL, so he could have had a much better season. He still has Geno Smith as his quarterback. He's a game manager. He doesn't really create on his own. I just think that while DK Metcalf does have the upside to be a wide receiver 1 theoretically, I just think the overall volume is going to be spread out in this offense, and I think it's going to be a very balanced approach in the offense. At wide receiver 18, I have Deebo Samuel of the 49ers. He finished as the wide receiver 15 this past season. He's 28.5 years old, so potentially going to be experiencing a little bit of decline relatively soon. He's dealt with injuries during a lot of his career, although when he does play, he has a crazy ceiling in this offense. I think he's going to be a very inconsistent player, but when he does get hot, he's going to really get hot. One thing to note, though, is his 2.74 fantasy points per target were good for first in the NFL. That speaks to him being a very good scheme fit for Kyle Shanahan and being very good at his role specifically. So he's going to be used on end arounds as a rusher. He's going to be used on drag routes and routes that don't ask him to make quick cuts because he's more of a straight line athlete and a running back essentially than a precision wide receiver in terms of his route running anyways. But he's a very good scheme fit. He's basically a running back that catches the ball. And he's going to have big ceiling weeks, but he's also going to have very low floor games because they have George Kittle, Ricky Pearsall, Brandon Aiyuk for now, Christian McCaffrey. Like I said, a lot of upside, but a very low floor from week to week. At wide receiver 17, I have Chris Olave of the New Orleans Saints. He's coming off a season in which he was the wide receiver 16. I think nothing has changed, and I think his situation is going to be the exact same, really, and his finish is going to be the exact same. He's 24.1 years old, and he is a very talented wide receiver. In fact, his 1,058 unrealized air yards were good for third in the entire NFL. And with Derek Carr still being his quarterback and Dennis Allen still being their head coach, I don't see anything changing. I think the offense is going to be atrocious. It's going to limit his touchdown upside. It's not going to get him as open. He's not going to be able to catch the passes because they're coming from Derek Carr. He's just going to be one of the safest floor players in the entire NFL without a really high ceiling. So if you can get him at wide receiver 16 to 19, anywhere in this general range, I think he's going to be a very safe player for you, but I just don't think he's going to give you the massive week-winning upside that some of the players in this tier, and obviously the players going ahead of him, can give you. Next we have Brandon Aiyuk at wide receiver 16. Fun fact, his 0.59 fantasy points per route were good for 5th in the entire NFL. And he is one of the better wide receivers in fantasy on a per-snap basis. Part of that is his own skill. He's very talented. But then he's also a great scheme fit for the 49ers. He's their man beater. Deebo is their zone beater, which makes it confounding in the Super Bowl why they were having Brandon Aiyuk do zone beating routes and Deebo Samuel do the man beating routes. And honestly, with Kyle Shanahan being the coach, that makes it the most confusing of all because he is a wonderful head coach and a masterful play caller. Now, as far as Brandon Aiyuk, currently with the 49ers, he is in a very crowded situation, and this ranking is treating him as if he's staying. If he leaves, he has the potential to skyrocket up these rankings or potentially go down in these rankings depending on where he goes, what scheme he's going to be in, and his general quarterback play. But as it stands, he's going to be a very safe player with a decent ceiling, but a very, very safe floor. The next tier consists of Malik Neighbors, Michael Pittman Jr., Devonte Adams, and Mike Evans. All of these guys are guys who I could easily see being the wide receiver 12 this year. So beginning with Malik Neighbors, he's 21 years old. He was a stud at LSU. He is one of the best yards after catch prospects I've ever seen in my life. Unfortunately, what happens a lot of times with good prospects? They go to horrible situations, and that's exactly where he finds himself in New York. Now, the bright side of that is, who else are they going to throw the ball to? Theo Johnson, Daniel Bellinger, Darius Slayton, Devin Singletary. So, as you can imagine, he's easily going to be the most targeted wide receiver in this offense by a large margin. I could honestly see him getting about 170 targets this year, which I think, even though they're not going to be the most accurate targets, I think what Brian Daboll is going to do is scheme him to be able to get yards after catch and get a lot of his passes closer to the line of scrimmage to limit Daniel Jones' ability to miss him. And therefore, I think on the back of a ton of volume and good scheming from Daboll, that he's going to be at worst a mid wide receiver 2, but probably a high-end wide receiver 2 and potentially a low-end wide receiver 1. At wide receiver 14, I have Michael Pittman of the Indianapolis Colts. He finished as the wide receiver 13 this past season. I have him as the wide receiver 14. I think he's going to be right around where he was this past season. He's going to be the number one option in Indianapolis. They did bring in A.D. Mitchell to overtake Alec Pierce. Josh Downs is dealing with an injury, their slot receiver, so I think that's going to open up some more targets, potentially if he does miss some time. But he's still going to have a very solid amount of volume. By the way, his 47.9% win rate versus man coverage was good for 8th in the NFL, so he is one of the best third down options in the league. He's going to be dominant. He's going to be a volume-driven player who is going to be one of the safest floors in fantasy football. It's just that his ceiling on a week-to-week basis isn't going to be quite as great. Anthony Richardson and really Shane Steichen are going to keep the chains moving. I just think his lack of touchdown production throughout his career is really what limits him from being one of these top-flight wide receivers. But his immense volume and skill is going to keep him from finishing anything lower than a mid-wide receiver 2 this year. So my wide receiver 13 is Devonte Adams of the Las Vegas Raiders. He's 31.6 years old. He is showing a little bit of decline, but he's still a top-flight wide receiver. He finished as a wide receiver 10 this past season. I think he's going to finish a little bit lower. They did draft Brock Bowers. He's going to eat into his target share. His 33% is probably going down to about 28 to 30% this season. He also had 1,088 unrealized air yards, which was first in the NFL. And with his defensive-minded head coach, his emphasis on the running game, and his projected terrible quarterback play, I expect his target accuracy woes to continue, thus reducing his elite ceiling that he could potentially have if he had somebody capable of throwing him the ball. So my wide receiver 12 on the season is Mike Evans of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. He's 30.9 years old, so a little bit up there in age. Honestly, he showed no decline this past season. He finished as the wide receiver 7. I do suspect him to finish a little bit lower as a low-end wide receiver 1 to potentially a high-end wide receiver 2. This is mostly due to Dave Canales leaving the Tampa Bay Buccaneers to become the head coach of the Carolina Panthers. I think the offense's efficiency is going to be reduced significantly, thus reducing red zone opportunities, but Mike Evans is a top-shelf wide receiver even at age 30, soon to be 31. And his 2.34 fantasy points per target versus man were good for 5th in the NFL this past year. So he has Chris Godwin to contend with in the passing game. K. Dotton, Rachaad White is one of the better receiving backs, even though he can't actually run the ball. I just think that the offense is not going to be scoring as many touchdowns, and I think he's going to be a volume-driven, high-end wide receiver 2, low-end wide receiver 1, who's probably going to score maybe 8 to 10 touchdowns, but I think this wide receiver 7 finish is not going to repeat itself. The next tier is Jaylen Waddle, Drake London, Marvin Harrison Jr., Puka Nacua, and A.J. Brown. So at wide receiver 11, I have Jaylen Waddle. Fun fact, even though he did finish as a wide receiver 34 this past season, in 2022, and now mind you, this was with Tyreek Hill in Miami, he finished as the wide receiver 8. I think that he's a low-end wide receiver 1 because of how amazing this offense is. Tua is the perfect quarterback for timing routes. He's one of the most accurate quarterbacks, even though his arm strength is absolutely suspect, and he brings no playmaking ability of any way, shape, or form. But, as I said, with the magnificent coaching of Mike McDaniel, this offense is going to be humming. He's one of the fastest and quickest wide receivers in the NFL, is, in my opinion, the best wide receiver 2 in the NFL. In terms of wide receiver 2s, he has the highest ceiling in the NFL. He can get you a 40-point game. The only issue is that he's going to be a little bit inconsistent potentially from week to week, but he's generally going to have a good game more than he's going to have a bad game, assuming health, which he did not have this past season. At wide receiver 10, I have Drake London of the Atlanta Falcons. He's only 23 years old, going into his 3rd season in the NFL. His only target competition to speak of really is Kyle Pitts. Darnell Mooney should receive some targets here and there, but he's going to be the absolute wide receiver 1. The offense in general is going to funnel through him and Pitts. He goes from having Arthur Smith as his head coach, which is just terrifying and scary, to having the Rams offense implemented via Zach Robinson, their former passing game coordinator. He's going to eat it up in this offense. He's actually going to be schemed and used to his strengths. He has not one but 2 quarterback upgrades. No more Desmond Ridder, Marcus Mariota, Taylor Heineke. Say hello to Kirk Cousins and Michael Penix Jr. Everything is looking way up from him, and you can kiss his wide receiver 4 in 3 seasons goodbye, and welcome to wide receiver 1 territory, Mr. London. At wide receiver 9, I have Marvin Harrison Jr. of the Arizona Cardinals. He's 22 years old. He's going to be the ex-wide receiver primarily for the Cardinals. Kyler Murray has sorely missed a DeAndre Hopkins, and now while Marvin Harrison Jr. isn't DeAndre Hopkins, he's one of the best prospects we've seen in some time. He has the best route running and technical skill at wide receiver I've seen in some time, at least of a prospect coming out. He has magnificent hands. Pass interference means nothing to this guy. He's going to be dominant from week 1 and throughout his entire career in the NFL. He has to deal with Trey McBride, who is going to receive a solid target share in his own right, but those are really, between the two of them, the only options in this passing offense that's going to scare anybody. So he's going to be fed a steady dose of targets. Kyler Murray's a great quarterback, so we can expect good things, and I do think he's going to be a wide receiver 1 from the moment he steps foot on the field. Next, we have Puka Nacua at wide receiver 8. He's 23.2 years old. He came out of nowhere to finish as a wide receiver 4. I just made a video this past week studying whether Puka Nacua would finish as a wide receiver 1 should Cooper Kupp have played every game with him. And now, while his role probably wouldn't have been what it was if Cooper Kupp had been in the lineup at the beginning of the season, if you take his per-game averages with Cooper Kupp in the lineup, he was the wide receiver 12 as a rookie. Well, good players, especially earlier on in their careers, if they perform well, earn more targets and get better volume. Well, if Puka Nacua was the wide receiver 12 on a per-game basis with Cooper Kupp playing, I think it's reasonable to project him to have a little bit better of a season. He's going to get better. It's been reported that he lost some weight and looks absolutely dynamic. Now, he did have a slight knee injury, which they say is absolutely not going to affect his week 1 status, so I'm not worried about that in any way, shape, or form. This Rams offense is going to funnel through him and Cooper Kupp. I do think he's going to be the number one target this season, and regardless, him and Cooper Kupp are going to see a steady amount of volume, and I think Puka Nacua is going to repeat as a top 10 wide receiver. I just think he's going to finish a little bit lower than he did this past season. And at wide receiver 7, we have A.J. Brown of the Philadelphia Eagles. He's 27.1 years old. He was the wide receiver 5 this past season. I do suspect he's going to take a little bit of a hit. Even though he's still an elite wide receiver 1, he's still going to be the number 1 target. I just think the Eagles are going to run the ball a little bit more now that they have Saquon Barkley in town. Now, while I think the touchdowns potentially through the air are going to go down a little bit, I do think the general efficiency of the offense is going to be improved. Therefore, he could finish a little bit higher than my wide receiver 7 ranking, but he also could finish just a little bit lower. Either way, he's going to be a dominant wide receiver 1. He has a crazy high ceiling. It shouldn't shock anybody if he averages right around 17 to 18 fantasy points per game. He goes through these stretches where he gets you 20 or 25 per game consistently, and then has dud games here and there. So there is some concern potentially on a week-to-week basis, but overall, this guy is one of the best assets at the wide receiver position. Now, in the S tier, we have Garrett Wilson, Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Tyreek Hill, and CeeDee Lamb. I think that any one of these players could be the wide receiver 1 this season. So we begin with Garrett Wilson. He has suffered the worst conditions for a wide receiver just about in the NFL. Him or Drake London, take your choice. Now he's getting Aaron Rodgers back. And now, while we don't know, per se, what Aaron Rodgers is going to look like, if there was ever a man motivated to prove doubters wrong, it's Aaron Rodgers this season. So if his body will allow him, he is going to do everything he can to make himself look good. And what's going to do that? Well, getting the ball to Garrett Wilson. It's been reported that he and Garrett Wilson in camp have a special connection. I've seen highlights here and there. It absolutely looks like it. So I think his wide receiver 6 valuation here is very fair. He could easily be the wide receiver 1 because he is one of the most talented wide receivers in the NFL. He's just been receiving the worst. He's been receiving worse than 32nd best quarterback play. Just think about that. He's easily the wide receiver 1. They brought in Mike Williams. He's not going to be a threat to Garrett Wilson. He's going to be a target hog. And by the way, over the course of his first 2 NFL seasons, he is the most targeted player in NFL history. His target share is likely to remain right about the same. The only difference, though, is those targets are now going to be coming from Aaron Rodgers. Draft him in fantasy, and assuming Rodgers' health, he is going to be dominant just about every single week for you in fantasy football as a volume-driven monster. Next, we have Jamar Chase. Just like with Garrett Wilson, he would have finished much higher if his quarterback hadn't been hurt. He did finish as the wide receiver 11, though, this past season. He's a dominant wide receiver. He's one of the few wide receivers that can give you a 50-point game. He does suffer sometimes from a week-to-week basis in terms of his consistency, but it's also hard when you don't have your starting quarterback. But he's still going to be the dominant number 1 wide receiver on this team. He's going to be among the leaders in total target share. Basically, nothing has changed in terms of his situation. He should, however, just be getting Joe Burrow back. So, should Joe Burrow be able to stay healthy, he absolutely could be the wide receiver 1. And we've seen that he can still be a very, very high-end wide receiver if Joe Burrow isn't there. Next, at wide receiver 4, I have Justin Jefferson of the Minnesota Vikings. Honestly, any of these players in this tier could be interchanged, in my opinion, and I wouldn't have any issue with it. He might just be the most talented wide receiver in the NFL. It doesn't matter who his quarterback is. He is a walking 20-point game. He's one of the most consistent wide receivers in the NFL. And if he is physically capable of catching a pass, it is absolutely going to be caught. One of the best separators and route runners we've seen in recent memory. This guy's just elite. So there really isn't much more to say. He's 25 years old, so he's stepping into his prime, at least historically, as a wide receiver. And draft him with confidence. It doesn't matter what his quarterback situation looks like. He is going to be the number one target in an offense led by Kevin O'Connell, so draft him with confidence. My wide receiver 3 is Amon-Ra St. Brown of the Detroit Lions. He finished actually as the wide receiver 3 this past season, so I expect nothing to change. He still has Ben Johnson as his offensive coordinator, so you should expect the efficiency shown this past season by the Lions offense to continue, if not potentially improve. Fun fact, he only had one game of less than 10 fantasy points this past season in a full-point PPR, so he is one of the most, if not the most consistent player in fantasy football. He's almost never going to lose you your week, and he's usually going to win you your week. Draft him with confidence, and he could easily be the wide receiver 1 overall. So my wide receiver 2 is Tyreek Hill of the Miami Dolphins. He also finished as the wide receiver 2 this past season. He's 30.4 years old, so we might end up seeing some decline soon, but he's so much better than most of the other wide receivers, and especially faster than just about any defensive back easily, that I don't expect anything to change. He's in a fantastic situation as the number 1 wide receiver on a Mike McDaniel-led team with Tua Tagovailoa, one of the most accurate quarterbacks in the NFL. It's a fantastic scheme. He's a fantastic player. He generally scores you at least 20 points a game. So I don't expect anything to change. Draft him with confidence, and he's a walking 20 to 30 point game. My wide receiver 1 is CeeDee Lamb of the Dallas Cowboys. He's still only 25.3 years old, so likely not even at the peak of his total production in terms of historically, at least at the wide receiver position. That's age 26, by the way. He finished as a wide receiver 1. Nothing has changed. He is, however, currently holding out for a new contract, so should it look like he's going to hold out into the season, maybe this ranking changes, but his situation is the exact same. He still has Dak Prescott. He's still easily the number 1 option on his team. Expect nothing but absolute dominance from him in 2024. The only potential issue is if he were to hold out into the season, so assuming he doesn't hold out, this is exactly where I would draft him. If he does hold out, obviously he would be falling a couple slots. But regardless, as of now, draft him with confidence. This guy is an absolute stud. So there you have it. Those are my top 36 wide receivers for the 2024 fantasy football season. What do you think? Do you agree with my rankings? Disagree? Would you have somebody else in these rankings? Please let me know in the comment section below. With that being said, I'm the Fantasy Football Strategist, your NFL breaking news source, and the Dynasty and redraft implications behind said breaking news. I am building a library of information with which you can use to dominate your redraft and Dynasty leagues in 2024 and beyond. Please like and subscribe. It would mean the absolute world to me. Thank you and have a good day.